I was on LinkedIn the other day and I came across this article entitled, "How Will ChatGPT and Similar AI Tools Change Teaching and Writing?" It was written by Suzanne Hall. She's at Caltech's Hickson Writing Center, and I thought it was an excellent piece. I want to go over some of what she said and share some of my own thoughts on that. Now, the first thing that stood out to me is she said tool designers are basically improvising, and they're doing so in an area where really a lot more forethought would be prudent. And I couldn't agree with that more. And I think the challenge is, and it's a practical one, is that this always happens with technology. There's really no incentive to slow down necessarily. It actually pays to be aggressive when it comes to business and when it comes to entrepreneurship and building new products and new technologies. If you spend too much time making the perfect product, then your competitor will make a slightly less good version of the product or a much less good version of the product. And they'll often come out on top because they'll get to market faster than you and they'll get all the funding, and whoever gets the funding ultimately wins the day. A friend of mine likes to say the only reason a startup goes out of business is because it runs out of money. So while I think it would be great to have a concerted effort, have committees, and have people discuss the implications and how we should develop these tools and release them for use by the public, I think it's not practical in a capitalist economy. That being said, I'm not sure I'm necessarily disagreeing with the author here. I think it's good to have idealistic views and to explore those. But ultimately, we have to understand that the way things play out with so many different participants, it plays out the way it does. And it's probably not necessarily a contentious point. I think part of the purpose of writing this article is to explore how ChatGPT can be used in teaching and writing. And collaborative learning stood out as a major theme in this article in terms of using AI to learn collaboratively. One exercise that the author talks about is to have the students each go home, use ChatGPT to summarize an essay, and then read the essay themselves, maybe write their own summaries, and then get together and compare and contrast the results. I think the thinking there is that reading through these, they'll come to the conclusion that these tools, these ChatGPT, for example, isn't necessarily perfect when it comes to summarizing writing. And while that may be the case today, it may also not be, depending on the depth and complexity of the writing and depending upon who's actually doing the summarization if you're comparing to a human. And then I think as we make further developments in these generative AI tools, this gap is likely to become increasingly narrower. And ultimately, it seems that the direction things are going, ChatGPT and other generative AI tools are likely to surpass human capabilities in the near future. So I would say that this is somewhat in opposition to the author's point of view. In particular, she claims that these tools are a poor substitute. But that being said, I think probably both of us would agree to some extent that these tools used in conjunction with traditional teaching methods and used in conjunction with a human expert can actually get similar or better results than just the human, and can do so in a quicker period of time. And so as a consequence, understanding how to use these tools and using them effectively in one's work will be instrumental in being successful in a lot of fields. Another point that I thought was interesting is using the chatbot as a mentor. And I think if you look through YouTube, you'll see that a lot of people are using ChatGPT to learn various different things. You can talk to this thing as if it's a highly knowledgeable expert in the field. And in a lot of cases, it can provide really helpful results. It can give you a learning plan. The author even mentions that you could talk to the chatbot late at night and it can provide you with encouragement. In a lot of ways, it is like talking to a human. And I think just the way that humans are built, that can be particularly helpful. I think that can really help keep students motivated. And I've talked about this before. And so I really think that's an excellent use of it. When we think about what are going to be the killer apps of these large language models, I think probably like this personal assistant or mentor role, there's good potential for a major successful product in that space. Now, one of the obvious problems of these tools that the author points out is that they prevent students from learning what the tool is doing for them. Instead, the student comes to rely on the tool. So it may make it difficult for students to learn to write in the same way as if they're doing it all by hand. I think the exercise of going through school and doing different activities to learn and train your brain to do what now the neural network is doing for you, there's an opportunity or potential for that to be taken away if students use these tools too frequently. Now, the author points out, probably correctly, that K-12 schools may choose to prohibit these tools entirely. And it's really difficult to do that with take-home assignments. And so that may lead to a lot of timed writing. She goes on to say that there's a problem because that's not typically how things are done at the college level and beyond. For example, when you're doing your job, let's say you're a writer, you're writing for a magazine, nobody's sitting there proctoring you, making sure you don't use ChatGPT. In fact, they'd rather you use ChatGPT so you can get it done 10 times faster. So there's a question of, are these schools actually preparing you to be competitive in a world where these tools exist and people will be using them and you will be using them in writing? In my opinion, going to timed writing like this would be a huge mistake because you really do need to learn to be competitive with these tools or you're not going to succeed in the job market. And so I think the only solution for this is for schools to adapt the curriculum immediately. And as the author suggests, it would be good to be really specific about when you're able to use these tools and when you're not able to. And I think there is some aspect of, hey, you have to, learn some underlying elements of writing and how to do it effectively. But at the same time, we don't want to forego the opportunity to understand how to leverage these tools. Can you imagine if students didn't learn how to use computers and then they come into the world and now they have to use computers? Imagine how much of a disadvantage they would be at as compared to preparatory school where they're really taught the basics and how to use computers effectively as they're going to use them in the job market. Now, the author puts forward an interesting suggestion, which is that instructors should make a direct and persuasive case to students. Hey, this is why we can't use ChatGPT in this particular assignment, but we can in this one. And that's because we really need to learn this material. And if you don't, you're not going to be able to use it as effectively as possible and be effective once you get out of school. Now, the author is working at Caltech, and so I think there might be a bit of a bias there. Caltech is a little bit different than most universities I've heard of. There's an honor code. When I was an undergrad there, the way it worked was most of the tests you would take were actually take-home tests, and they would probably be like self-timed. And maybe there would be one portion of it that's open book and another portion that's closed book. So it might be this section you have to do in 4 hours closed book, right? And then this section you do after, you're allowed to take a 15-minute break in between, and that'll be closed book or something like this. But these are the type of tests where I think, it's not clear that these would work if you didn't have this strong honor code and a kind of a small school in this culture. So there's probably a bit of a bias there. I'm not sure that this will work in general. And I think the challenge is that as long as students are looking at their grades and using that as a metric and really just trying to optimize for that and minimize the amount of work they do, there's going to be a temptation to use these tools when you shouldn't be using them because it is the easy path in comparison to actually learning the material. And so by using these tools when you're not supposed to, you may not only have an advantage over the other bit of the class, but be able to get it done much more easily. However, in my experience, I think it is important, just as a general statement, to treat students as trustworthy. I think if you treat them as trustworthy, by and large, they'll be trustworthy. And I think that's beneficial overall. They'll be more motivated to work and they'll get a lot more out of it. Now, of course, an article like this wouldn't be complete without mentioning plagiarism and intellectual property. And I think there's a big challenge when it comes to this because people say, and in fact, Japan is going this way, it's plagiarism to train on somebody else's written work. And a lot of maybe artists are complaining about this. The problem is I think that that's a very difficult position to be in philosophically because the human brain is trained the same way these large language models are trained. Let's say you're getting a college degree. You read through all the classics, you read through everyone's work. It influences how your brain learns. And when you go to write, what you actually end up writing down, what you generate is a consequence of how you've learned and what your brain has become from reading the intellectual property of others. And so it's hard to say that there's a more than a superficial difference between whether, large language models and the way that people learn and the output of both. I'll also say that it takes creativity to use these tools, and perhaps the way you use them may end up as part of the intellectual property. Now, obviously, the output that's generated could actually, especially because it's so highly influenced, could easily violate existing copyright laws. And so I think it's important that we develop tools, and there probably will be valuable companies built around tools that, and in fact already have been, that detect plagiarism. And so I think, just using an AI and it reproducing work that somebody else did is not an excuse for plagiarizing. So whatever actually comes out of there, I think, could and probably should still be subject to the same notions of plagiarism and copyright. And so hopefully the laws and policies we already have in place can effectively handle large language models and other generative AI. Now, the final point I want to discuss from this article is the drawbacks of generative AI. And of course, there are drawbacks. Perhaps one of the most significant ones is that they can make things up. In fact, I read that some lawyer actually used ChatGPT to create a legal brief, didn't check the references, and it turned out it just made up the references, like this person's name, this case, and it was just completely made up. So I think using them for factual information, they still have to be fact-checked, kind of like anyone would be, but they can just make things up and appear confident, and that is a major drawback. Another issue is that they are trained, and they're trained on large training sets, and so there could be a bias inherent in the training set. Some of the early examples with these AI chatbots before GPT, for example, I think somebody developed one and put it on Twitter, and because the internet has so much hate on it, it actually ended up becoming like racist and bigoted and would just say horrible things, and ultimately had to be shut down. So, that's an extreme example, but another example could be that just because of the way that there exist biases in society today, that the training sets that end up going into these machines are unbalanced. And so it's very difficult, especially given the probably large quantity of data that's going into training these, to actually develop a balanced training set and build a large language model that, is accessible and fair in general and provides unbiased perspective. So overall, this is a really good article. I think you should check it out. It's definitely a topic to be thinking about. You can find the link to the article in the description below. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.